My name is Jack Hunter, and I am 52 years old. I have been a ranger in Denali National Park in Alaska for over a decade. My family lives in the town of Healy, which is about a half-hour drive from my station. My wife Sarah lives there with our youngest 13-year-old twins Mike and Emma. The older kids are now separated, with John working as a pilot in Anchorage and Mary teaching biology in Seattle. Sarah teaches at a local school and has always been supportive of my decisions, even when I decided to change my job as a lifeguard to a gamekeeper. Prior to that, I worked for the Yellowstone Park Search and Rescue Service for 15 years. I helped lost hikers, rescued people in the mountains, and participated in complex operations. But in the summer of 2002, there was a terrible forest fire. We were rescuing a family of 5 who were trapped in their summer house. The fire was coming from all sides. Visibility was almost zero because of the smoke. If it wasn't for a local gamekeeper who knew every path, every detour in the area, we wouldn't have made it. It was then that I realized that I wanted not just to save people, but to prevent such situations, to protect the forest and those who are in it. People often ask me if I am bored in the taiga. I always answer the same way. It is never boring here. Every day something happens. Every day is a new story. And today I want to tell you some of these stories. They are very different. Some of them may even seem unbelievable, but each of them is a part of my life here in the harsh Alaskan taiga. The first story I want to tell happened in that very summer of 2002. It was unusually hot at the time, and the entire Yellowstone Park was like a powder keg. Dry grass, cracked earth, hot air. We all knew all it took was one spark, and there it was. Lightning struck a dry tree, and the fire began to spread with incredible speed. The first report came in around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. A young ranger noticed smoke in the Bear Creek area, where there were several summer cabins. I was in charge of the rescue team at the time, and we moved out immediately. As we flew in the helicopter, I could see the orange blaze growing rapidly. The wind was driving the fire straight toward a residential neighborhood. We were met on the ground by the local gamekeeper, Mike Thompson, a big bearded man with a weathered face. "There's the Anderson family," he said at once. "Husband, wife, and 3 kids. The road has already been cut off by the fire." There was no time for reflection. The fire was covering more and more of the forest, the smoke obscuring the eyes. Mike suggested going through the old creek bed, a longer way, but a chance to bypass the main hearth. "I know these places like the back of my hand," he said, and there was such confidence in his eyes that I decided to trust. We walked, ducking from the heat and smoke. Mike moved confidently, not hesitating to pick a direction where I could only see a wall of fire. 20 minutes later, we reached the cabin. The family was panicked. The youngest girl was crying, but they were alive. The way back I remember as if in a fog. The smoke was eating my eyes. The heat was unbearable. Mike led us through some ravines, thickets, along barely visible paths. At one point, the path was blocked by a burning pine tree. "There's a detour here!" Mike shouted through the roar of the flames. And indeed, after about 50 meters, we found a safe passage. When we finally made it out to the evacuation point, I was covered in soot and drenched with sweat, but something inside me had changed. As I watched Mike say goodbye to the Anderson family, as the father of the family tearfully shook his hand, I thought, this is the real calling. Not just to save people, but to know your station as a part of yourself, to make the only right decision in a critical moment. A week later, I applied for a transfer to the gamekeeper service. Sarah supported me, even though it meant moving to Alaska. "You always wanted to do something bigger," she said at the time, and she was right. My first day in Denali began in October 2002. The snow was already lying, the days were getting shorter and the nights colder. The head gamekeeper, Frank O'Neill, handed me a map of the area and said, Your territory is the Northwest Quadrant. 70 square miles of taiga, 3 mountain ranges and the valley between them. Can you handle it? I nodded smugly then. After 15 years in the rescue service, I thought I was ready for anything, but the taiga quickly showed me how wrong I was. That day I decided to go around the nearest site to familiarize myself with the territory. I took a radio, compass, food, and water. The weather was clear and frosty. The snow crunched under my feet. The air burned my lungs. I followed the animal trails, marking important landmarks on the map. Fallen trees, notable stones, streams. 3 hours later, I spotted tracks. Large paw prints in the snow. Grizzlies. It was clear from the size of the tracks that the bear was huge. Strange, I thought then, because usually at this time of year they are already preparing for hibernation. I decided to check where the tracks led. The trail led me to a small clearing. There I saw a ruined hive of wild bees and scattered pieces of honeycomb. The bear was obviously preparing for winter, gaining weight. I took out my notebook and made a note. I would have to check whether all the dens in the area were occupied. Suddenly, I heard the cracking of twigs behind me. I slowly turned around and froze. There was a grizzly standing 30 paces away. Huge, brown, with grayish fur on his scruff. He was looking right at me, sniffing. I'd seen bears many times in Yellowstone, but this one was special. His gaze was not aggressive, but rather curious. I slowly raised my hands, letting him know I wasn't a threat. "Hello, big one," I said calmly. "This is your new neighbor now." The bear stood for a few more seconds, then snorted and leisurely walked off into the thicket. Only then did I exhale and feel my heart pounding. Back at the office, I told Frank about the meeting. He grinned. "Ah, this is old Gray. He's lived here for about 15 years. Smart beast, no trouble at all. But keep your distance with him, he can be unpredictable." That incident was my first lesson. I realized that being a gamekeeper is not just about walking through the forest and keeping order. It means knowing every big animal on your property, understanding their habits, respecting their territory. Gray became my first neighbor in these parts, and over the next years we had many more meetings. But what I remember most was the look in his eyes on that first day. The look of a host deciding whether or not to accept you. I passed that test, and the taiga began to slowly accept me, though the real tests were yet to come. The winter of 2010 was particularly harsh. The temperature dropped to -40. The snow was falling in a wall, and the wind was so strong that it bent the tops of spruce trees to the ground. In such weather, even experienced hunters preferred to stay at home. But it was on such a day that I received an alarm signal. A group of 3 hikers had not returned from the trail. 2 guys and a girl, all from California, had decided to hike to the lookout despite warnings of an impending storm. They were last seen at the foot of the North Ridge. I contacted search and rescue, but a helicopter was impossible to get up in this weather. There was no time to wait. A person can survive at most 24 hours in such a frost. Having collected everything I needed, I set out on a snowmobile. Visibility was not more than 10 meters. GPS devices were not working properly because of the magnetic storm. An hour later, I found their first tracks. They had turned off the main trail, apparently having lost their orientation in the snowstorm. The trail led to a crevice between the rocks, a bad sign. Snow pockets often form there, real traps for inexperienced travelers. Leaving the snowmobile, I went on foot. The wind threw prickly snow in my face, and every step was difficult. Then I heard a faint cry from somewhere to my left, barely audible through the howling of the storm. When I shone my flashlight, I saw the red flap of a jacket sticking out from under the snow. They had indeed fallen into a pocket of snow. The 2 guys tried to dig themselves and the girl out, but only got more bogged down. Luckily, they guessed to build some sort of snow cave. It saved them from hypothermia. I acted quickly. I attached a rope to a rock ledge and went down to them. The first thing I did was to give them hot tea from a thermos and energy bars. Then I started pulling them out one by one. The girl was the most difficult. She had twisted her leg and could not walk on her own. I had to carry her to the snowmobile. The way back was a real ordeal. The snowmobile could hardly pull all four of us. Fuel was running out, and the storm was getting worse. I used an old trick that Frank had taught me, navigating by the slope of the trees. They always lean to the southeast here because of the constant winds. When we finally reached the station, I didn't even have the energy to speak. The hikers got off with mild frostbite and fright. Later they sent a letter of thanks, but I still remember the look in their eyes when I found them in the snow. The look of people who had lost all hope. That night when I got home, I sat by the fireplace for a long time. Sarah brought hot coffee and just sat silently beside me. She knew, sometimes you don't need words. The taiga once again reminded me that you can't let your guard down here for a minute, especially when other people's lives depend on your actions. And this story happened recently, in the spring of 2012. It showed me that even after 10 years of work as a gamekeeper, the taiga can teach you a lesson that you will remember for the rest of your life. The snow was just beginning to melt, exposing last year's grass. Bears were waking up from their winter hibernation, and this is always the most dangerous time. Hungry and irritated, they can be extremely aggressive. That afternoon, I was checking my usual route when I noticed strange behavior from the birds. They were circling over one spot and screeching loudly. As I got closer, I heard growling and thudding. The sound was coming from the ravine. Cautiously approaching the edge, I saw a young grizzly furiously attacking something at the base of an old spruce tree. As I looked closer, I realized there was the den of old Gray, the same bear I had met on my first day. Gray had aged over the years. He was still strong, but the younger bear surpassed him in speed and fury. I could see the blood on the old bear's gray fur. He was clearly losing this fight. Normally we don't intervene in such conflicts. It's the law of nature. But Gray was not just a bear. He was part of this forest, my old neighbor. I knew what to do. I pulled out my flare gun and fired into the air. The sound echoed through the ravine. The young bear froze, then reluctantly backed away. He wasn't a coward, but he didn't want to mess with a new threat either. Throwing one last glance at Gray, he disappeared into the woods. Gray rose heavily to his paws. His movements were slow, but the same fire still burned in his eyes as it had 10 years ago. He looked at me, and in that moment, something happened. It was like a circle had closed. The first day he had decided to accept me. Now I had helped him. We were even. "Rest, old boy," I said quietly. "Your home is safe." He snorted as he had then on our first meeting, and slowly disappeared into his den. I checked the place for a few more days, but the young bear did not return, and Gray. He lived another summer, and the next spring his den was empty. Such is life in the taiga. There is no room for sentimentality, but there is room for respect. Every animal, every tree, every stone, all these are parts of a single whole, and our task, the task of gamekeepers, is to preserve this balance, to be a part of this ancient order. For more than 10 years I have been walking these trails. During this time a lot has changed. My children have grown up. My beard has grayed. New scars and wrinkles have appeared. But one thing has remained unchanged: my love for this harsh land and a sense of responsibility for it. People often ask me if I regret my decision to become a gamekeeper, especially when they learn that I could now live in a big city, work in the office of the rescue service, get a good salary. But I always answer the same way. Every person must find his place in life, and I have found mine. Here, among the age-old fir trees and snowy peaks. Sarah understands me like no one else. When I come home after a hard day, She just puts a cup of hot coffee in front of me and listens to my stories. The younger ones are also asking to go on rounds with me more and more often. I guess the genes are kicking in. Who knows, maybe one of them will wear a gamekeeper's uniform one day. In the meantime, I continue my work. Every morning, going out on the route, I know that this day can bring anything. A meeting with a wild animal, rescue of a lost tourist, or a collision with something inexplicable. But that's the beauty of my job. Here in the taiga, every day is a new story, a new lesson, a new reminder of how small we are in the face of nature. And you know what? I wouldn't trade this life for anything else. Friends, thank you for watching the video to the end. If you like these stories from the life of an Alaskan gamekeeper, please support our channel. Put a like and subscribe to not miss new stories from the depths of the wilderness. I'm very interested in your opinion. Share your thoughts in the comments. Or maybe you too have amazing wildlife encounters you'd like to tell us about. See you in the next issues.